Imagine a hill, an ordinary green hill just outside the modern Chinese city of Xi'an. In spring, trees bloom here. In autumn, fog settles low across the earth. But if you brought modern equipment to this place and sampled the air, you would find something deeply unsettling. An invisible, heavy cloud of toxic vapor hangs over this hill. Mercury concentrations here exceed safe limits by dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. Why? Because directly beneath your feet, buried dozens of meters down, lies something scientists have been afraid to unseal for half a century. Down there is a mechanical model of an entire empire, where rivers of pure, lethal mercury flow beneath a ceiling studded with pearl-encrusted stars. And guarding all of this madness is an army of 8,000 silent clay soldiers. When we say the word empire today, what image rises before our eyes? The orderly ranks of Roman legions, perhaps, or British dreadnoughts slicing through ocean waves. But there was, in human history, one attempt to create something so monolithic, so complete and total, that the very word China in European languages, China, still carries within it the echo of that ancient name, Qin. The story of Qin Shi Huang is a perfect, almost textbook example of how extraordinarily difficult it is for a historian to separate truth from political spin. Our primary written source is the celebrated Shiji, the Records of the Grand Historian, by the great Chinese historian Sima Qian. A magnificent work. But there is one small, vital detail. Sima Qian wrote a full century after the events he described. He lived under the Han Dynasty, and the Han Dynasty had come to power by overthrowing the Qin. What do we know about victors? Victors always write history to suit themselves. They love to portray their predecessors as bloodthirsty monsters, sadists, and madmen. Against the backdrop of a deposed tyrant, your own sins, your taxes and repressions, seem rather less frightful, don't they? So when we open the chronicles and read of our hero's birth in 259 BCE, we find ourselves, from the very first line, entangled in the sticky web of court gossip. Sima Qian cheerfully relays a rumor. Was Ying Zheng even the legitimate prince's son? Or was his true father a vastly wealthy, cunning, and cynical merchant named Lu Buwei? The story goes that this Lu Buwei gifted his already pregnant concubine to the future ruler of Qin in order to place his own bastard upon the throne. You see how this works? It is the classic black propaganda of antiquity. The most devastating insult one could hurl at an aristocrat was to suggest that this cruel tyrant was, in truth, the illegitimate son of some common tradesman. But let us set the gossip aside. What do we know with absolute certainty? We know that a boy named Ying Zheng became king of the mighty state of Qin at the age of 13. Just sit with that number for a moment. 13 years old, a teenager. And what throne was he ascending? He was ascending a throne in what historians romantically call the Warring States period, Jianguo. But there was nothing romantic about it. It was a bloody meat grinder. 300 years of unrelenting, merciless war. 7 great states tore at each other, annihilated entire cities, betrayed their allies. War was not an unwelcome interruption to peaceful life. War was the only mode of existence. And it was in this atmosphere that the boy king grew up. There was not a single person around him who could be trusted. Real power lay in the hands of regents, schemers, and gray cardinals. Chief among them, none other than Lu Buwei himself. The records describe filthy court scandals, his mother's favorites, conspiracies involving false eunuchs. It was a life of constant tension, forever bracing for a knife in the back from those closest to you. It was here, in these dark palace corridors, that the psyche of the future emperor was formed. He absorbed the central lesson of his life. People are weak, dishonest, and dangerous. No one can be trusted. Everything must be controlled. The true story of Qin Shi Huang begins the moment he grows up and decides it is time to burn the stage sets behind which the puppeteers have been hiding. In 238 BCE, when Ying Zheng turns 21, he strikes. The young king seizes absolute power with terrifying ruthlessness. A palace rebellion by his mother's favorite is crushed in blood. The conspirators are executed. The all-powerful regent Lu Buwei is removed from office, sent into exile, and soon after, from despair and dread, takes his own life by drinking poison. The old fixers depart the stage, and stepping into the spotlight is a man with cold eyes and iron logic, who will become the architect of a new reality. His name was Li Si, and he would serve as chancellor. Li Si was a devoted follower of the philosophical school of legalism, Fa Jia. To put it plainly, legalism is absolute political cynicism. It is an ideology that places no faith in human goodness, in Confucian morality, in reverence for tradition or filial piety. The legalists believed in three things: law, rigid and inescapable; punishment, disproportionately severe; and efficiency. For Ying Zheng and Li Si, the state was not a family, as the Confucians taught. The state was a mechanism, a machine, and people were simply its components, gears and cogs. If a cog misfires, you throw it out. If a gear turns the wrong way, you grind it down until the sparks fly. Together they transformed the state of Qin from merely a country with a powerful army into a war conveyor belt, a society of total mobilization. Military valor was rewarded with land and rank. Cowardice was punished not only by death for the soldier, but for his entire family. And this machine began to run. 10 years of unbroken blood, burning cities, and millions of refugees. For the first time in its history, China was unified under a single man's rule.
Was Ying Zheng simply a maniac and a butcher? Let us recall one of the most famous episodes of that age, the assassination attempt by Jing Ke in 227 BCE. The kingdom of Yan, knowing it was next in line for conquest, dispatched a killer to the Qin court. The envoy, Jing Ke, came bearing a map of lands that Yan was supposedly willing to cede voluntarily. Hidden inside the scroll was a dagger, so venomously poisoned that a single scratch would be fatal. At the decisive moment, right before the stunned eyes of the entire court, Jing Ke unrolled the map, snatched out the dagger, and lunged at the king. Chaos erupted. By law, the guards had no right to enter the throne room without a command. Ying Zheng sprinted in terror around a bronze pillar, struggling to draw his long ceremonial sword from its scabbard. At last he succeeded, and he cut his attacker literally to pieces. This episode has passed into legend. Films have been made about it. But notice how fascinatingly the historical perspective shifts. For some generations, particularly those who groaned under tyrants,
Jing Ke is a great patriot hero who tried to stop a monster at the cost of his own life. For others, in eras when China yearned for unity, Jing Ke was merely a failed terrorist, a pathetic reactionary who tried to halt the wheel of history and the great unification of the nation. History, my friends, almost always depends on which side of the Great Wall you happen to be standing.
The year is 221 BCE. The dust over the battlefields is settling. Yin Zhang sits in his capital, the city of Xi'an, and grasps one simple truth. He is no longer merely a Wang. He is no longer simply a king. That title is catastrophically inadequate to describe his new power. He assumes an entirely new name and title, one that would transform the political language of East Asia for 1,000 years to come. He becomes Huangdi. Huang translates as brilliant, divine, august. Di is an ancient term for the highest deities and ancestor rulers, and before it, he places the character Shi, first. Qin Shi Huang, the first sacred emperor. He envisioned his dynasty continuing, second emperor, third, all the way to 10,000 generations. A naive and presumptuous plan. But calling yourself a god is not enough. Conquering a vast country with swords is only half the battle. How do you make this patchwork empire, where people speak different languages, worship different gods, and use different currencies, function as a single organism? And here Shi Huang performs his great administrative revolution, the act for which he is simultaneously cursed and celebrated. He categorically, on pain of death, abolished the old feudal system. No fiefdoms for relatives, no semi-independent principalities. This entire vast territory was carved into 36 commanderies. And who was sent to govern them? Not hereditary aristocrats, but officials appointed personally by the emperor, selected for ability and loyalty. Today, you are appointed governor. Tomorrow, if you fail to meet the tax collection quota, you are dismissed and sent to build the wall, or executed. A brilliant and ruthless vertical chain of command. But the empire's greatest instrument was standardization. Just think about the scale of these reforms for the 3rd century BCE. Shi Huang decreed, throughout the empire, only one coin would circulate, round, with a square hole at the center, a design, incidentally, that would persist in China until the early 20th century. Standard weights, standard measures of length and volume. If you were a grain merchant and your measure did not conform to the imperial standard, you would lose a hand or be sent to forced labor. And his most brilliant, most far-reaching decision was the introduction of a unified written script. In different corners of China, people spoke dialects. They simply could not understand one another by ear. But the emperor decreed, henceforth, all official documents, all books, all reports were to be written in a single, standardized script, the small seal, Xiaozhuan style. The character meaning person or water would now look absolutely identical in the north by the Yellow River and in the warm south along the Yangtze. It was this decision, burned into culture like a brand, that created the China we know today. It forged a cultural monolith that did not crumble even when the Qin dynasty itself burned in the fires of rebellion. He descended to such micromanagement as to standardize the axle lengths of carts and wagons. Why, you ask? So that the wheel ruts on unpaved roads would be uniform across the entire empire. With a standard axle width,
A cart would not become stuck in a foreign rut in a distant province, which meant that the imperial mail, tax collectors, and, most crucially, troops could be deployed across this vast country without delay. It was the absolute triumph of technocracy over chaos, the triumph of soulless but perfect logistics.
But perfect order always has a price. And in the Qin Empire, that price was human blood, spilled on an industrial scale. Shi Huang was obsessed with infrastructural megaprojects. He seemed to believe he could remodel the very geography of the world. We all know about the Great Wall of China. Of course, Shi Huang did not build it from scratch in the stone, crenellated form we photograph today. Those are the constructions of the much later Ming dynasty. What he did was something different. He ordered the existing scattered earthen ramparts of the northern kingdoms to be joined into a single, colossal line of defense. The wall had more than military significance. It was a boundary between worlds. On this side, civilization, imperial order, laws and standards. On the other side, the Great Steppe, chaos, the nomadic Xiongnu. To build the wall, hundreds of thousands of men were driven. Peasants under labor conscription, prisoners of war, convicted criminals. The conditions were horrific. Famine, cold, disease, the lash. Popular memory preserved haunting legends that workers who died of exhaustion were mortared directly into the body of the wall, so as not to waste time on burials. Modern archaeologists do not always find physical confirmation of this, but metaphorically, the people were right. The Great Wall of China stands literally upon human bones. And the wall was not the only project. The Lingkou Canal, dug in 214 BCE to link the basins of the Yangtze and Pearl rivers for supplying the army in the south. Roads driven through mountain ranges, grandiose palaces, among them the legendary Yipang Palace, which by accounts was so vast that 10,000 people could have sheltered beneath its roofs. Archaeologists today believe Shi Huang simply never lived to finish it. Only an enormous earthen platform was found. But the sheer scale of his ambitions. But physically subduing people was not enough. Their minds had to be subdued as well. And we arrive now at one of the emperor's most terrible crimes in the eyes of posterity. 213 BCE. That year passed into history under the name the Burning of the Books. Chancellor Li Si delivered before the emperor a fateful speech. Scholars are using knowledge of the past to criticize your present. They agitate the people. They dare to debate your laws. The emperor's response was merciless. A decree was issued. All historical chronicles of all states, save the history of Qin, were to be collected across the empire and publicly burned. The poetry anthologies and philosophical treatises of the ancient schools, including the works of Confucius, were to be burned. Only purely utilitarian literature was to survive. Books on agriculture, medicine, divination, and pharmacology. Anyone who dared conceal a book, death for his entire family. If two people dared to discuss the ancient poems with one another, public execution in the marketplace. This was not merely a blow against Confucianism. It was the first systematic attempt in world history to establish an absolute state monopoly over truth and over memory. The emperor wanted to reset time. He wanted the history of the world to begin with him. And the following year, 212 BCE, traditional history records an even darker episode. The burying alive of 460 scholars,
allegedly for daring to criticize the emperor or for deceiving him in his pursuit of magic. Modern historians treat this account with great caution. Many believe it to be later Han propaganda, a fabricated horror story invented to blacken the ruler. Most likely, repressions and executions of intellectuals did occur, but the image of 460 old men buried alive in the earth became an eternal symbol of brute despotism arrayed against free thought.
And here, my friends, is where the most mesmerizing and terrible part of our story begins. You see, there is a paradox at the heart of this. The more power Qin Shi Huang concentrated in his hands, the more afraid he became. He had defeated every earthly enemy. No king could challenge him. But one enemy remained. One that could not be pierced with a crossbow bolt, could not be bribed or clapped in irons. That enemy was time and death. Shi Huang perceived his own mortality not as a natural biological process, but as a personal insult, as an administrative oversight to be corrected immediately by imperial decree. He gathered around himself Taoist sorcerers, magicians, and alchemists known as feng shi. He dispatched enormous expeditions, thousands of young men and women aboard ships, out into the eastern sea in search of the mythical islands of Penglai, where immortal celestial beings supposedly dwelled and the herb of immortality grew. Not one of these expeditions ever returned. Legend holds that this is how Japan was settled. And so the emperor turned to alchemy, and into our story flows a substance that would play a fatal role in the fate of the empire's first man, Mercury. In ancient China, Mercury was regarded with an entirely singular reverence. It was called liquid silver. Let us stand for a moment in the shoes of an ancient alchemist. The logic was impeccable. According to classical Chinese philosophy, all things in the world are composed of the energies of yin, cold, liquid, feminine, lunar, and yang, hot, solid, masculine, solar. Mercury was a wonder of nature. It flowed like water, the purest yin, yet was heavy and gleamed like a metal, the purest yang. It did not rust. It was alive. If gold was the symbol of eternity, then Mercury was living gold. Therefore, the magicians reasoned, if one could properly prepare mercury and consume it, it would transmit its properties to the human body. The body would become as incorruptible, as eternal, as impervious to decay. And so, Qin Shi Huang began to take these pills of immortality on a regular basis. Pills that, alongside cinnabar, mercury sulfide, frequently contained arsenic and lead. Today, any toxicologist will tell you this was a slow, exquisitely efficient method of self-destruction. Mercury is a heavy neurotoxin. Chronic poisoning by mercury vapors and compounds causes irreversible destruction of the central nervous system. Let us look at the emperor's behavior in his final years. He becomes pathologically suspicious. He suffers from savage insomnia. He is seized by uncontrollable fits of rage that spiral into paranoia. He moves constantly between his hundreds of palaces via enclosed, walled corridors. No one, on pain of an agonizing death, was permitted to know in which particular bedchamber the Son of Heaven was sleeping on any given night. He hid from evil spirits, not understanding that the chief demon had long since taken up residence in his own brain. That despotism that disproportionate cruelty which we attribute to a corrupted character. It is entirely possible that it was not a tyrant's political strategy at all, but the direct clinical portrait of severe mercury poisoning. The great unifier of China was being transformed, slowly, day by day, into the mad prisoner of a silvery fog inside his own skull.
But Shi Huang was a pragmatist. If the alchemists should somehow fail, and death proved inevitable after all, one had to be prepared to continue one's conquests in the afterlife. And while the emperor's mind dissolved in poisons, 30 kilometers from the capital, at Mount Xi'an, the most vast and demented construction project in the history of humanity was getting underway. The building of his necropolis. It all began in 1974. Local farmers were digging a well when they suddenly struck a piece of fired clay that looked like a human shoulder, and then a bronze arrowhead. And so the world discovered the Terracotta Army. The Terracotta Army is a manifesto of transcendent human ego. We are accustomed to seeing them on television, rows of gray, dusty figures standing in trenches. But you must imagine them as they were 2,200 years ago. 8,000 warriors, life-size. And they were not gray. They were painted in breathtaking, vivid colors. Crimson armor, green tunics, pink faces, black hair. For the pigment, an extraordinarily rare substance was used, Han purple, Chinese blue, a synthesis process of a complexity comparable to modern advanced technology. But what strikes most deeply is this. Among these 8,000 figures, no two faces are the same. How was this achieved? Archaeologists determined that a genuine industrial manufactory of the ancient world was operating here. Bodies, legs, and arms were produced in series using molds, but the heads were sculpted individually. Masters applied separate pieces of clay, shaping unique ears, noses, cheekbones, mustaches, and expressions. From the calm severity of veterans to the wide-eyed fear of young recruits. Why the individual features? Because ancient Chinese believed in the magic of resemblance. If a clay double accurately replicated a living person, then, after the ruler's death, the warrior's spirit would inhabit that figure. And so that the spirits would have weapons to fight with, real, functional arms were placed in their hands. Bronze swords coated in chrome, a technique the West would not discover until the 20th century. Crossbows with complex trigger mechanisms, and tens of thousands of actual arrows. This was an army for eternal war in the underworld. They were arranged in strict battle formation: vanguard, archers, heavy infantry, war chariots. And all of them face east, toward the 6 kingdoms once conquered by Shi Huang. Even from the grave, he had no intention of ceding them an inch. It was an attempt at the bureaucratic and military annexation of the afterlife. But the Terracotta Army is merely the outer guard. They stand 1.5 kilometers from the center of the tomb. What lies there, beneath the main burial mound, as tall as a 15-story building, which remains unsealed to this day. Sima Qian left us a description of the central chamber that for millennia was regarded as a beautiful but impossible fairy tale. The historian writes, "The craftsmen made replicas in Mercury of the 100 rivers, the Huanghe and the Yangtze, and the Great Sea. Mechanisms were made so that the mercury would flow perpetually. On the ceiling were depicted all the celestial constellations, and on the floor, the contours of all the lands. Lamps were fueled with the fat of sea people, most likely whale blubber or seal fat, so that they would burn without extinguishing for an eternity. Mercury here served two functions. First, the sacred. It was the alchemical water of immortality, nourishing the emperor's spirit. Second, the defensive. Mercury vapors in an enclosed space are lethal. Any tomb robber who breached the charged crossbow traps, also described by Sima Qian, would inhale this spirit of eternity and die in agony. For a long time, scholars merely shrugged. Rivers of mercury. Come now, it is a metaphor. But in the late 20th century, and again as recently as 2020, international research teams conducted extraordinarily complex physico-chemical analyses of the soil of the mound itself. The results stunned the scientific world. Directly above the depths of the tomb, the soil is literally saturated with mercury. The concentration of vapors there is such that no natural anomaly can explain it. What is more, the distribution of this mercury is uneven. It corresponds, in a haunting approximation, to the contours of ancient China's river systems. Sima Qian had not lied. The legend was the truth. The man who feared death had indeed built himself a mechanical paradise in utter darkness, sealed behind thousands of tons of poisonous metal. But the cost of this subterranean marvel was monstrous. When the emperor died, his successor issued a command. All concubines of the first emperor who had not borne him children were to follow him. They were killed or buried alive. And then all the engineers, craftsmen, and workers who knew the layout of the traps and secret passages were driven into the tomb, and the entrance was simply buried under stones. Tens of thousands of people were walled alive inside this mercury hell, so that not one secret could escape.
The supreme historical irony is that the elixir of immortality killed the emperor. In 210 BCE, during one of his habitual inspection tours of the empire, he was still searching the coastline for sorcerers with their deathless potions. The 49-year-old Qin Shi Huang suddenly fell ill and died with terrifying swiftness. His body, ravaged by poisons, simply gave out. And here unfolds a scene worthy of Shakespeare's own pen. The master of the world is dead. All around are the desolate roads of eastern China. In the imperial entourage are only the chancellor Li Si, the powerful scheming eunuch Zhao Gao, and the emperor's youngest son, Hu Hai. They are gripped by terror. They understand. If news of the harsh tyrant's death spreads across this empire, already groaning under impossible taxes and forced labor, rebellion will ignite in the same instant, and they will be torn to pieces. They decide to conceal the ruler's death. The body of Shi Huang is seated in an enclosed carriage with drawn curtains. Meals are brought to the carriage. The eunuch Zhao Gao enters it and presumably emerges bearing signed edicts, which he himself forged, while simultaneously signing the death warrant of the elder, legitimate heir.
But it is a hot Chinese summer. The emperor's body begins to decompose with terrifying speed. The stench becomes unbearable. To conceal this reek from the thousands of soldiers in the convoy is impossible. And then the great mind of Li Si devises a brilliant and humiliating solution. They order entire cartloads of salted, putrid fish to be purchased from the coast, and these carts to proceed before and behind the imperial carriage. The smell of rotting fish entirely masked the odor of the decomposing monarch. Just imagine the final scene of this drama. The man who unified China, the man who challenged the gods, conquered time itself, lord of the Mercury rivers and clay legions, was returning to his capital beneath the unbearable stench of rotting herring. His empire, built to last 10,000 generations, outlasted him by a mere 3 years. The eunuch Zhao Gao would force Li Si to confess to treason and have him executed by bisection. A great peasant uprising flared. In 206 BCE, the rebels stormed the capital, slaughtered the entire imperial family, and burned the magnificent palaces. Enraged soldiers poured into the underground corridors of the Terracotta Army, seized the real weapons, and with furious abandon shattered the silent clay warriors to fragments with clubs, taking revenge on the statues for the cruelty of their master. So what remained in the end? Ash and shards? No. Paradoxically, what mattered most survived. The idea endured. Qin Shi Huang proved that China could be won. Yes, the empire fell, unable to bear the weight of its own bloody tension. But the Han dynasty, which succeeded it within a few years, that would cursed the first emperor at every crossroads, in practice preserved nearly everything he had created. They kept his system of commanderies, his officials, his coins, his roads, and most importantly, his written script. Shi Huang had forged an iron framework, a steel matrix, within which China has existed for over 2,000 years. Was he a great builder? Without question. Was he a deranged, paranoid tyrant who drowned his country in blood? Undeniably. He was a man who sincerely believed that order mattered more than human life, and that the unity of the state mattered more than personal freedom. Gazing today into the empty eyes of the terracotta warriors, we see not merely ancient art, we see frozen, kiln-hardened fear, and the extraordinary, near-divine pride of a man who tried to stop time with stone, clay, and poisonous silver. He did not stop time, but he made us remember him, and perhaps that is the only form of immortality available to us. And on that note, one might think the story is complete. The monarch is dead, the empire in ruins. But the story of China was only just beginning. This was the Gilded Archives channel. If you found this fascinating, hit like, subscribe, and be sure to leave a comment. Do you believe the unification of China was worth such a monstrous human cost? Until we meet again.